Love, exciting and new.
Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever.
It's a love.
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships of Bermudan and British Registry.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. On the last episode, we went all in on dissecting one of the most important documents in papal history, a document that consisted of 27 dictates outlining the imperial aspirations of Pope Gregory VII. These 27 dictates were called the Dictatus Papae. On this episode, we find out what happened in the wake of the publishing of those dictates, and I promise you, you won't want to miss this one. This is episode 125, entitled The False Monk. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Pope Gregory VII wrote a letter to Bishop Anno of Cologne in late March of 1075, just 1 month after his 27 dictates, to preach of the sanctity of marriage and the necessity for men and women to be chaste prior to their wedding day. Oh, and in this same letter, he reminded the German bishop that, according to Michelle K. Spike in her book, Tuscan Countess, quote, unchaste priests were forbidden from carrying out the functions of their office, and he demanded they resign rather than impose upon their Savior a criminal and grievous servitude. End quote. In short, he was super serious about his reforms of clerical celibacy. He probably wrote this letter after having morning coffee with Matilda of Tuscany there in the Lateran Palace. Now that said, the rumor mill was churning once again in Rome, but it didn't detract from the Pope's actions one bit. The reverberations of Gregory's dictates spread like wildfire across Europe. As mentioned at the end of the last episode, the new English king, William I, even forbade his bishops in England to travel to Rome. The king's blessing was sufficient, and he sought to distance the English church from the Pope just enough to keep it independent of Rome. But other reactions occurred as well, the most notable being in Germany, well, as you can imagine. King Henry IV was still dealing with the Saxon rebellion, but upon hearing of the Pope's dictates, something clicked in the 20-something-year-old king. He was no longer the weak-willed, petulant child he'd once been. Henry IV went on the offensive against Saxony with a ruthlessness that shocked the kingdom and the Pope. He knew that he could not possibly react to Gregory VII without dealing with the Saxons first. So he unleashed hell on these Saxons, like all at once. Records from inside and outside Germany report of gigantic dust clouds created by his army as they barreled down toward the Saxon army, taking the rebels by complete surprise. Many Saxons were simply unable to even dress themselves before fighting commenced. They marched a 2-day march in just 1 day and arrived in late afternoon only to receive word that Henry ordered his men to suit up because they would attack and fight even if it took all night, which was pretty unheard of in those days, fighting after sundown, that is. It was an epic slaughter, it seems. Even Matilda's own chronicler, Donizone, Spike tells us, reported of Henry's quote-unquote strength and cruelty in battle. Even Matilda's husband, Godfrey III, the Hunchback, quote, acquitted himself with great valor, end quote. The date was June 9th, 1075, and Henry IV had devastated the dangerous Saxon rebellion. Due to his decisiveness, his boldness, his cruelty, and his increasingly powerful leadership, as I said, something changed in young Henry that day in June, and he was truly the king of Germany at that point. Saxony even bent the knee once and for all. It was now time for Henry to deal with this pope in Italy. News of the battle and its aftermath must have hit Gregory like a load of bricks. He was comfortable in that moment, knowing the upstart little wretch, Henry, was weak and occupied. But, again, things changed drastically in the blink of an eye. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Then word came that Henry was marching an army across the Alps to come pay a visit to his Duchy of Tuscany. Now, the threat was not only on him at this point, but also aimed at his beloved Matilda. Henry immediately invested the bishoprics of Milan, Spoleto, and Fermi, all within Tuscany, mind you, thumbing his nose directly at the Pope and the Tuscan noblewoman. He knew the game at that point. The rest of 1075 was a long and tense series of months. Beatrice and Matilda continued to hold court in Tuscany together with periodic visits to Rome to Gregory. As for Gregory, he was hurriedly sending letters to anyone and everyone who would listen to him, declaring his dictates to be spread and followed to the letter. But at the heart of each letter was a panicky appeal for support. The walls were closing in on him. In fact, unbeknownst to him, one of his own cardinal bishops secretly approached Robert Guiscard during this time and offered him the imperial crown if he had helped to depose Gregory. It was a shameful act of disloyalty, and thankfully for Gregory, the Norman Duke wanted no part of it. Guiscard turned down the Holy Roman Emperor's crown, if you could believe it. As John Julius Norwich in his book The Other Conquest put it, quote, Robert, seeing that the whole plan was hopelessly unrealistic, had refused to become involved. End quote. Gregory's enemies were trying everything to get him out of the driver's seat of the Catholic Church. By December 1075, the issue would reach a tipping point. Weeks earlier, Henry IV had convened his dukes and other various noblemen in the town of Goslar. This would be a celebration of his recent victory over Saxony, which would have been awkward considering his Saxon dukes were also there to reaffirm their loyalty to him. So, yeah, there's that part too. The feasts were also to declare his 1-year-old son, Conrad, as his heir, and have each nobleman declare their undying loyalty to the boy. A standard affair, really. Nothing out of the ordinary, until the issue of Gregory's 27 dictates was raised. The nobility became infuriated, thus raising the ire of the king once again, and a plot was hatched. They recreate a similar situation that Henry's father had done decades earlier. Now, if you remember, Henry III had forced Pope Gregory VI, a lot of parallels there, the uncle of the current pope, mind you, into exile, where the pope had died. Also, if you remember, Gregory VII had accompanied his uncle Gregory VI into that same exile and watched his uncle pass away in shame. The Germans believed they could pull off the same plot again. But how could they possibly get that close to Gregory VII? Well, the Germans contacted the rivals to the Pope's family. The Pope, remember, belonged to the Pierleoni family, a prominent Roman family that began with his grandfather, a wealthy Jew who converted to Christianity, thus elevating his station even higher in Rome. Their rivals were the Cenci family, and it would be through them that the plan would unfold. On Christmas Eve of 1075, as Gregory was holding one of the church's most sacred masses of the year in the already centuries-old church on the Esquiline Hill in Rome, a church, Spike tells us, was divinely inspired by the Virgin Mother herself when she dropped snow in a specific pattern upon that hill back in the year 356 AD. A church that at the time held the only relic of Jesus' manger, the very same one they believe their Savior spent his first nights of this earthly existence nestled in. Well, just after midnight of December 24th, peace within the Santa Maria Maggiore would be shattered. The Cenci family and its thugs, fueled by the support of the German king, disrupted Gregory's offerings of the Eucharist to each Roman parishioner standing patiently in line to receive it. These thugs had pretended to be waiting in that same line to receive the body and the blood of Christ, only to descend all at once upon the Pope in a coordinated effort to overwhelm the situation with confusion and fear. And it worked. They grabbed the aging Pope and, in Spike's own words, quote, they dragged the Pope past the crowd of the clergy and Catholic faithful out of the basilica and across the city of Rome, imprisoning him in the Cenci's tower. End quote. Now, it's worth mentioning that Spike, in writing this, had visited the Santa Maria Maggiore church, which still stands today. She walked the aisles and marveled at the 36 Ionic columns of marble. She gazed at the 5th century mosaics and 8th century reliefs still on its walls. She was surrounded by the sense of space that the basilica conveyed. She wrote the following, a haunting and rather disturbing reflection of the scene. Quote, what struck me most about my visit to Santa Maria Maggiore was the enormous length of the church's nave. The militiamen dragged their papal captive its entire distance, and no one came to his aid. End quote. The city, Rome itself, was stunned to silence that Christmas Eve in 1075. The unthinkable had happened. The Pope had been violently ripped from his sacred task on one of the holiest masses of the year in front of a crowd, and no one did a thing to help the poor man. He was quickly taken to the Cenci family tower within the city and kept there for the remainder of the day. But Gregory's own family would hardly sit idly by and watch their rivals hit them hard and walk away without consequences. All day they rallied their supporters, and finally, as the earliest rays of sun brightened the sky on Christmas morning, they raided the Cenci's complex, stole Gregory from the tower, and ran as fast as they could back to safety, leaving the Cenci's to deal with the massive crowd that had gathered to oppose them, and which essentially was running cover for the escaping Pierleone family and its pope. Spike says that from the Cenci Tower one could see the Lateran Palace, and, specifically, the tower that Matilda was currently staying in that night. They could have stared at each other all night without knowing it. It was certainly a harrowing ordeal. Some of you may be thinking, well, wait a second here. Gregory VII was captured by a Roman family. How is that any worse than Leo IX being captured by a Norman army? Fair point. But the circumstances were entirely different. Gregory was peacefully conducting midnight mass, while Leo was on a battlefield, for starters. Also, who did the capturing was another issue. The Cenci family were longtime sworn enemies of Gregory's family, and they had the backing of an openly hostile foreign king, while the Normans were merely fighting for their legitimacy and had not wished a single hair on Leo's head to be harmed. I mean, it's recorded that they treated him more like an honored guest than a prisoner, whereas the Cenci family threw Gregory in a tower that contemporary writers referred to as quote-unquote vast and spooky. Context, as always and in everything, context matters. Poor Matilda, to switch gears, probably had a gut-wrenching Christmas Eve herself. She could do absolutely nothing to save the one man she cared for the most. But when the sun rose on Christmas morning, word arrived that he was safely back in the Lateran Palace. Sadly, though, Matilda's relief would not last long. A summons from Pisa arrived shortly after Gregory's ordeal. Her mother, the mighty Beatrice, surviving widow of 2 Tuscan dukes, had fallen ill. Matilda rushed to her mother's side, where she would only leave once between late December and early spring. In the wake of the kidnapping of the Pope and subsequent rescue, King Henry IV immediately got to work. Ideally, having Gregory move to Germany was probably his ultimate goal. Outright killing the Pope would never be okay, but exiling him and holding him while installing his own Pope, well, that would probably suffice. Essentially, Henry's father had done it with Gregory VI again, the current Pope's uncle, and it worked marvelously in that Gregory VI just died while in exile. In fact, Henry was using his father as his model for how to deal with the Pope, as Henry III had deposed 3 different popes back in his day. The problem was that the papacy was nothing like it had been 30 years earlier. Gregory VII and his 27 dictates was proof positive of that. They never would have flown had the papacy not undergone fundamental change during those 3 decades. The king gathered all of his men, from the nobility around Germany and its other domains, as well as the clergy, including those who were already stripped of their priestly authority by Gregory. They all met at Worms in Germany on January 24th, 1076, for what would amount to be one of the most important events in medieval history. Well, to be clear, it wasn't just this council that was one of the most important events in medieval history. Rather, it would kick off a series of events that would become just that. This is the first volley. So in Worms in late January 1076, all the king's horses and all the king's men were gathered to declare in one mighty voice Germany's official stance on Pope Gregory VII. Well, to begin with, they did not refer to him as Pope Gregory VII. Not one time. From the beginning to the end of the council, he was known throughout the entire proceedings as just Hildebrand. A symbolic gesture, of course. But that was just the start of it. The famous Council of Worms found him guilty of 3 separate crimes. The first crime was, Spike says, quote-unquote, ascending to the papacy in violation of the papal election decree, essentially throwing Gregory's own words against him. The second crime was assuming the role of the ultimate judge and arbiter of Christendom. Here we can think of his 27 dictates and how the Pope, and not bishops collectively, was the ultimate judge on all matters, and that the Pope was incapable of making errors in his judgment. And finally, the third crime, Gregory VII was an adulterer. So let's unpack these, shall we? Crime number 1, election fraud. The first crime amounts to election fraud, if you think about it. Archdeacon Hildebrand helps put into place the College of Cardinals back in 1059 under Pope Nicholas II, but then has his good buddy Ugo Candida stand up, disrupting the funeral of later Pope Alexander II, and publicly declare Hildebrand as the new pope just 3 years earlier. He essentially takes the reins of the papacy a full 3 months before he donned the silly little hat on June 30th. Everything after that was a mere formality. I even raised our eyebrows at this a couple episodes ago. So, what was the point in the college if the founder wasn't even going to use it? And as a quick point to showcase the impact of Gregory's papacy so far on the clergy as a whole, the same man who declared Hildebrand Pope during Alexander II's funeral, that man Ugo Candida, well, he was at the Council of Worms, and he was a key witness and accuser. It seems even amongst Gregory's longtime friends, the Pope had made sworn enemies since taking the papacy. Crime number 2, removing the power of the bishops. The second crime amounted to a blanket usurpation of a bishop's authority. A bishop is supposed to be the head of the regional church. It was meant to be localized, to deal with local populations and local issues, and tailor the rules and customs to that particular population, so long as they didn't violate any of Jesus's teachings or the Pope in Rome's decrees, generally speaking, not to the word, not to the T that Gregory VII was trying to implement. Europe was still a vast place, at the time, with wide open, unpopulated spaces and large pockets of paganism well into the 11th century, more so the further east and northeast you went. It was certainly changing rapidly, in fact, but it still holds that the bishops, in their solemn effort to spread the faith, were to acclimate to the area while acclimating its people to the teachings of Jesus. Bishops needed to have some semblance of ultimate authority, but Gregory's 27 dictates removed this ultimate arbiter role from them, and this created a massive amount of resentment across Europe. Spike recounts the records from the council, which read, quote, "We cannot speak of it without tears. The name of Christ has almost perished, who, moreover, for the very indignity of the thing is not astounded that thou should usurp and arrogate to thyself a certain new and unlawful power in order to destroy rights which are the due of the whole brotherhood." End quote. Kind of leave it at that. Crime 3, here's the big one, adultery. Crime 3 was the count of adultery. This one cut deep, no doubt, because it involved a woman he cared for dearly being caught up in his own affairs. To be crystal clear, there is absolutely no evidence, none whatsoever, of the two becoming physically intimate with one another. Of that, the records are clear. However, as we know, a mere unsubstantiated rumor, however false, can damn a person even today. What's more is that Duke Godfrey III of Lorraine and Tuscany was present at the Council of Worms as well, and he supported this accusation. Spike writes, quote, "Spite over Matilda's desertion might have contributed to the vehemence of the charge, but what man would take on the public humiliation of declaring he had been cuckolded without believing it was true?" End quote. The bishops at the council wrote the following of this charge, quote, "Furthermore, thou hast filled the whole church, as it were, with the odor of a most grave charge concerning the too familiar living together and cohabitation with a strange woman. By which thing our sense of shame suffers more than our cause, although this general complaint has resounded everywhere, that all the decrees of the Apostolic See have been set in motion by women. In a word, this new Senate of women, the whole circle of the church is administered." End quote. This quote was sad and funny at the same time. The fact that Matilda, the strange woman, by the way, had counseled Gregory meant that everything he decided was moot. It was all null and void. But it wasn't just Matilda. See, they were using one of their own beloved noblemen, Godfrey III, and his very public issues with his estranged wife, Matilda, to charge the Pope. The Pope's relationship with Matilda didn't help matters for sure, but the bishops were already pretty miffed at their own queen regent, Henry's mother Agnes, who ruled until Henry had reached majority. Now, Agnes had always supported the papacy in Rome, and they resented this, as well as her grasp on power for that decade or so until Henry took the crown. In their eyes, the arrogance of women like Agnes and Matilda, and even Beatrice, who ruled confidently and steadily while Godfrey was back in Lorraine, well, this couldn't possibly stand. Matilda was merely their scapegoat to charge Gregory with one more thing. This one more thing just happened to fit nicely into their overall plan, especially considering what they were charging him for directly conflicted with one of his champion reforms, clerical celibacy. See how it ties in. In the council's closing procedures, the bishops transcribed a letter that would be sent to Pope Gregory VII, personally addressed from King Henry IV. It read the following, quote, "Henry, not by usurpation but by God's holy will, king, to Hildebrand, not pope, but false monk. This salutation thou hast deserved, a praiser of strife. Thou art cursed instead of blessed by every order in the church. The archbishops, bishops, and priests thou hast trodden under thy foot like slave, devoid of will. Christ has called us to the empire, but not thee to the papacy. Thou didst acquire it by craft and fraud. In scorn of thy monastic cowl, thou didst obtain by gold favor, by favor arms, and by arms the throne of peace, from which thou hast destroyed peace. I, Henry, by God's grace King, with all our bishops call on thee, descend, descend. End quote. These bold words, full of spite and vitriol and ridicule, they hit hard, but they were dealing with a pope unlike any other to come before him. I can't stress that enough. Gregory was unique. Gregory's imperial aspirations were far greater than young Henry's. When the council at Worms was completed, they sent a priest named Roland to Rome to hand-deliver Henry's letter that he calls Gregory a false monk. He is reported to have said, upon delivery to the Pope in front of other bishops, he's reported to have said this, quote, "The king of the land and the bishops order you to leave the seat of which you are not worthy." He then turned to the assembly and said, "The emperor will come to Rome at Pentecost to conduct a new pope, because this one is not a pope, but a wolf." Well, this was the Feast of St. Peter, February 22nd, 1076, and the Pope did something that no Pope had done in over 700 years. Gregory VII excommunicated a sitting monarch. Lambert of Hersfeld wrote the following, quote, "As soon as news of the excommunication spread, all the Roman world shook to its foundation." End quote. And it was a monumentally cataclysmic move in terms of proving the full power of the Pope, as well as proving Gregory's insistence in the imperial aspirations afforded the papacy. King Henry IV was no longer in the folds of Christendom, and his eternal soul found itself in a precarious position. Remember from the last episode the Thomas theorem that I mentioned? As far as Henry was concerned, his soul was in jeopardy of finding itself outside the gates of heaven. And these consequences of Gregory's excommunication were as real as anything else in this world. His actions would show this as true in the coming months and years. And in order to understand this, we have to understand that it was true to Henry. However, he still had the strength of the German kingdom and clergy behind him, which was nothing to scoff at, really. And let's not forget about the ace in his pocket, Godfrey III. Though Godfrey was one of his most loyal vassals and had been estranged from his wife for quite a while at this point, he was still effectively the Duke of Tuscany. This gave Henry a key passage between Germany and Rome that he could utilize however he pleased. What's more, the indomitable Beatrice, the one powerhouse that had not only kept Tuscany running smoothly in the Duke's absences throughout the years, but also had kept her daughter Matilda safe and able to make her own decisions, well, Beatrice was in Pisa in the earliest months of 1076, dying. As 1076 was beginning, it seems no one really had the edge on the other when it came to Gregory and Henry. But just 4 days after King Henry's excommunication, something happened that once again shifted the balance of power in northern Italy. On the way back from Worms on February 26th, Godfrey III, Matilda's estranged husband, was camped somewhere outside of Anvers in the county of Flanders. In the middle of the night, Godfrey had to relieve himself, so he walked out of his quarters and into the designated area for such things, and well, shall we say, for those longtime listeners, he received the old Edmund Ironsides treatment. That's right, as Godfrey was taking care of his business, while everyone else slept in the camp, someone drove a sword through the Duke's backside, we'll say. Sadly, the Duke lingered for almost a week, just enough time to suffer tremendously from the wounds to his undercarriage and bowels. it was also just enough time for him to name an heir. The heir will be a man who will play into our story of the First Crusade, actually. So keep this man's name in mind. So before I tell you the name, here's a quick connection for you. Do you remember Count Eustace II of Boulogne? Count Eustace II was the kinsman and good friend of King Edward II of England, and later, ironically, companion of Duke William of Normandy during the Norman invasion of England. Listeners of this show might remember him as Count Eustache due to his majestic lip foliage, that magnificent crumb catcher. Well, as Count Eustache was working with William in England, Eustache's son, also named Godfrey, was named Godfrey the Hunchback's heir, actually. The young man was the Hunchback's nephew, thus Matilda's nephew by marriage, and history knows him as Godfrey of Boulogne, again from the Crusades, really. Young Godfrey of Boulogne had assumed control of the duchies of Lorraine and Tuscany, and Aunt Matilda would have some decisions to make. Oh, and one sad fact about the Hunchback's death, Spike tells us, was that Godfrey III, the much-beloved soldier and duke, refused his last rites because, well, he felt by excommunicating his king and by the Pope's treatment of his marriage and enabling his wife to, keep her distance that the church itself had, in Spike's words, betrayed him. As of February 26, 1076, Matilda of Tuscany was a widow. And widows in the 11th century, politically speaking, were terribly exposed. Beatrice was still Matilda's champion, though. As long as she lived, Matilda held what little power she was afforded. Now, over the next 2 months, the months of March and April of 1076, Matilda was inundated with accusations that she was actually behind her husband's assassination. As far as I can tell, though she may have had motive when it came to her inheritance and, how she actually never received it because when married she lost it, there's no firm evidence of this accusation being true, as far as I've been able to find. In the midst of this, Beatrice died on April 18th. Spike writes, though, quote, her mother clung to life long enough to outlive the most dangerous threat to her daughter's inheritance, end quote. But what's more important to our story is what happened by June 1076. Sure, there was no firm evidence that Matilda pulled the trigger on her husband's assassination, but something curious happened almost immediately. Those same Tuscan vassals that simultaneously resented, feared, and respected Matilda's father, Bonifacio, years earlier, well, they immediately threw their support behind her. They quickly recognized Matilda as their lord, and to hell with that other Godfrey way up north in Boulogne. Matilda had never issued her own decree or even made a donation in her own name up to this point, Spike says, and she was now the Lord of Tuscany. Spike writes, quote, on May 27, 1076, at Marengo, Matilda took under her protection the Abbey of San Sisto. On June 15th, Dome Matilde Comitacie held court for the first time on her own in Reggio Emilia, end quote. That's right. On June 15th, she is for the first time recognized in writing as Dame Matilda Comitacie, or Countess Matilda, an honorific she would have to this day. Spike adds, quote, and although Matilda and Gregory remained inseparable for the next 5 years, the accusations against them simply stopped. Whether because the charges were untrue or because the stakes had just been raised, I do not know. End quote. We'll end this episode in June of 1076. Matilda had become the undisputed ruler of her father's domains. King Henry IV of Germany had been excommunicated, and he was at present without control of Tuscany. And Pope Gregory VII, well, he was officially kicking off what came to be known as the investiture controversy, one of the most tenuous moments in all of papal history, and one of the most memorable episodes in medieval history. Until next time.